Hello, welcome. Thanks for watching us. Welcome to PAX 2020 Online. My name is Mary, and I have a pleasure and great honor to run this panel, which was prepared and created by two fantastic gentlemen. They are, of course, with me. Let's warmly welcome these outstanding authors, I'd say authorities in this very field, this creative field of gaming, Jeff Richard and David Larkins from Chaosium. Hi, guys.
Hi, Mary.
Hello.
Okay, so let's start with the first question. I know I would be boring, maybe, because I'll start with the most obvious, yet the broadest and I think tricky question, which is, what is exactly a mythology? Because I need to remind you that we're on the panel considering mythology in games, just to make sure everyone knows. So, what is mythology, Jeff?
Well, so I use mythology, or for me, mythology is those magical or sacred stories just on the other side of conscious thought. And it's the realm of archetypes and of Jung's collective unconsciousness. It is that realm of stories that explain to us why we're here, why do we die, why are we born, why does the cosmos work the way that it does. And it's something that it is how human beings understand the world around them. We are creatures of myth, not creatures of science and rational thought. And so to me, mythology is, it's the foundation of almost every other creative endeavor and creative media, be it literature, be it music, be it art. It all ultimately boils down into our myths about ourselves.
Okay.
So
that was
very
good.
yes.
Yeah. And yeah, a very, very broad opinion, I'd say.
Well,
David? Yeah.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Oh, well, and part of the reason that I have such a broad definition of it is when we get into the use of myth in gaming, we have to really keep in mind how much broader it is than how that term is usually used.
That's true. Absolutely. You know, I'm very much in the same camp as Jeff. You know, I take a broad approach when it comes to mythology and gaming. You know, to me, mythology is, you know, the core elements of a dream world, but extrapolated on a broad base. So it's like a mimetic dream that's being shared by thousands or millions of people. So it's something that people use to connect to each other. It's a shorthand, you know, for understanding cultures, your own culture and other cultures as well. It's a way to link together by finding similarities between different mythologies. You know, Jeff, you mentioned Jung, finding those common touch points that appear around the world in different human cultures, which obviously has applicability to gaming because we work with archetypes in games. And so mythology really is just the original way of breaking things down into archetypal explanations and visions and you know, sharing those amongst each other, amongst ourselves.
Okay. Thanks for that. Actually, when we are discussing mythology, I'm thinking of another question that leads us to the inspiration. I mean, you actually just touched this topic, but I have to ask, why? Why do the mythologies serve as a great basis and inspiration when creating settings for games? Is this because of that archetypes that you, David, mentioned? Or is it because the fact that, for example, a mythology is something that people accept and or believe without, you know, any doubts, I think, right? Even though some elements are inexplicable or illogical. And thus, maybe it's easier to accept the rules of the newly created fantastic world. Or do you have other opinion? David?
Well, I think that, you don't necessarily have to accept a mythology in order to work with that mythology. But at the same time, I think that it does create a set of rules, whether you believe it or not. And mythology is not dogma, so the fun thing about mythology is that you can play around with it. You can modify
Hmm.
a myth. You
Hmm.
can, change it to suit your own needs. Since the Arthurian mythos is sort of my thing right now. I'll just point that out as like a perfect example of these characters and stories changing over time to suit the societies that are telling them. So I think that's why they are such a great basis, because it's a collection of ideas that you can just take, and you don't have to believe in them, but you can take them and work with them and then make them your own.
All right, Jeff.
I don't think that if there isn't a mythology in your setting, I don't think that we find it believable.
Yeah.
Because as human beings, we ask the sort of questions that mythology provides answers, or at least stories to. So, David and I both work on really in your face mythology heavy settings like Glorantha or Pendragon. But another example would be World of Darkness. World of Darkness actually has a very well constructed mythology for it.
Yes. Yes.
And so does another White Wolf or Old White Wolf game, now Atlas, Ars Magica. These
Yep.
are games where the setting is more believable because there are explanations for the sort of questions that your characters would have that are told in the manner that human beings actually tell them. So, with World of Darkness, it's that, you're a vampire, and where do vampires come from? Well, Cain, right?
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
a founding myth. Well, why are we vampires? Well, because Cain. Well, what happens to what is our purpose here on vampires? And there's that whole set of stories that make that ground that setting and give it the sort of mythology that makes something believable, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense, even if it's not believable, even if it's irrational. In fact, arguably, it's more believable the more irrational it is.
Absolutely.
Okay, David, do you want to add something?
I feel that when you are challenged by an irrationality or an illogical element of a myth, that is the beginning of the process of being illuminated by that myth, because it kind of cracks your head open, and gets you
Yeah,
to look at things differently, right?
yeah. Definitely. And this is actually a good way to move on to another question, but it's actually connected with the previous one, because you have you have mentioned this, open-mindedness and this change in a myth, right? And I'd like to discuss the topic of this playing with myths. I mean, when creating a game, is it easier to base it on a familiar example, or is it better to think of something completely new? Like, do you find all those familiar stories too limiting for you as the authors? For example, Icarus has to lose his wings, or does he not? Yeah, that's the reversal of this familiarity is good for games, makes them fresh, unpredictable. What do you think, Jeff?
Well, we've dealt with both. So just to give uh, the Pendragon game, we're dealing with the core of Arthurian stories. So it's, we're primarily relying on Mallory and various writers who wrote the core corpus of the Arthurian myths. On the other hand, Glorantha is it's experimental myth making. There's no uh, previously written master list of stories about Glorantha. Greg made them up, and later I made up more of them, and so it's an experimental one. I think both, I think both are equally easy to work with, as long as you have a feel for what are these stories trying to do? What are you trying to do with them? And then it doesn't particularly matter if you're dealing with the myths of Hesiod and Homer, or of Mallory, or of something that you're making up yourself. The only advantage that real world mythology has is it means somebody else wrote it. And so there's less for you to create on the fly.
Yep, definitely.
And it is hard to write a good myth.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, because myths deal in archetypes, a lot of the time you're just riffing on some familiar elements to begin with, or you can always put interesting spins on existing myths. Icarus losing his wings could be recontextualized in a modern way, as a sci-fi story, for example, right? So.
I think it has been. Wasn't that one of the vignettes in Brazil?
Yes, it was actually. Thank you. Yes, absolutely. So, that was the core imagery in Brazil, actually.
Exactly.
So, yeah. It's I view it as not something you have to fight against, but rather something that helps you to actually be more creative, because I love riffing off of things anyway. So, give me sort of a core myth, and say, go to town and see what you can come up with that puts an original spin on this. That to me can be more fun, or as much fun as coming up with an original myth.
Do you actually know, or do you have any favorite RPG scenario based on the myth, or created on the basis of the myth, but in a completely, reversal way? Do you have any, David?
I mean, to take things back to, well, I mean, Jeff actually mentioned World of Darkness, which I think is a great example of that, where you're taking the biblical, stories of Genesis and recontextualizing them in this very, dark and horrific way. So that would have to be one of them for me. But also just within Pendragon, you can do so much with just the material that's in the Great Pendragon campaign. For example, so Merlin would be, one of my favorites, where Merlin can be this benevolent tutor, or he can be this adversary, and it's always very interesting to me to see how players recontextualize myths at the table. That's a continuing source of entertainment to me, because I might run Pendragon for one group, and they hate Merlin with a passion, and then in the other group, Merlin's their greatest ally.
All right, Jeff?
Well, I mean, my favorite is always Glorantha, because it's set up that each of the cultures, all of the cultures share a common set of myths, the Gloranthan monomyth, but they all, every group interprets what they mean and puts weight on them differently. So, you have like your character is a good follower of Orlanth Mary, but there are other cultures that accept all of the same stories that you have and conclude Orlanth is a very bad and evil god. To me, that's also the sign that you've got a good set of mythology because it's possible for different groups to look at that same core story and come up with radically different meanings as to what that means. And it kind of ties also into a thought that I was having, that mythology tends to be very personal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which makes it great for gaming, because it tends to be something that your character experience and use to understand the world around them. But it's different from a religion, which is a set of big rules that everybody is supposed to have, more or less, or at least in a written religion with a theology. We're all supposed to have the same understanding what the meaning of this is. But with a lot of mythology, these are stories that are left for you to understand what they mean to you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Considering Glorantha, I will definitely elaborate on that and ask you questions about Glorantha. But now I'd like to make us step back to what David said, because he said something very, very interesting, among others, about this mythology and myths when, in case of scenarios, right? And I'd like to just ask you a short question. Did you ever actually have such a feeling or such a situation when running a game? You were running a scenario based on a particular myth, for example, Pendragon, and your players knew that it's this very particular myth, right? This very basis. Did you have such situation? What did you do, if you did, David?
So that's one of the great hidden strengths of Pendragon or Glorantha is the ability to put your players directly into the myth, either explicitly or as an echo, like a hero quest, right? So in Pendragon, you can have a hero quest, so to speak, you know, in its own way. One of the things I have done here and there, you know, not too much, but here and there, is if I see an opportunity to take a player character from my group and put them into one of the existing Arthurian stories in the place of the protagonist or even the antagonist, I will do so. So, like in a campaign I ran, one of the knights had fallen under the influence of Morgan Le Fay and had become her lover, and she manipulated him. And basically, I put him in a place. If you're familiar, there's a story from Mallory that John Steinbeck actually did a reimagining of, or modern reinterpretation of Sir Accolon, being given Excalibur, which Morgan had stolen and sent to kill Arthur. And so I talked to the player beforehand. I said, "Are you comfortable with this kind of situation? Like, you're probably gonna get killed. This will be the end of that character, because that's kind of how it turns out, and he was all for it. He thought that was a great end to that character's story. So we played through it, and the rest of the group watched, biting their nails the whole time, because there's this knight, this guy that he's known for years, and he's trying to kill Arthur. What's going on, So it took this, this depersonalized story and made it very personal for the group.
Yeah, great, fantastic. I mean, creativity of the players, it's outstanding, right? Isn't it? Exactly. Jeff, did you have some similar
Oh, well, I
situation?
think David's even played in a couple of those.
Oh, wow.
One of the fun things in Glorantha is that you can have something where you the players know, or you've told them, this is a myth of your particular culture. You need to try to reenact it in real. And this is a hero quest. And we'll get to that eventually in our group. Where and of course, nothing ever works the way it does in the stories. There's always the stories only tell part of this, or you screw it up. And you watch as the players try to figure out what's the important parts of the story. How do we get the story back on track so that we can go through and carry out this myth and release its magic, or gain its magic, or do whatever for whatever the purpose of the story is. But we've got kind of this guidelines of this story. But now we have to start winging it because we've already screwed it up because we're players, and
they're bringing their own baggage to it too. They have their own agenda, Yeah.
Exactly, and I love that, and especially when they complete it, because they've now remade that story and they've made it their own. and I love that. I love that experience, and players usually have a complete blast out of that because they feel that they've done something significant, important.
Yeah.
And this is the fun of playing around with mythology.
Yeah, and actually, and giving the choice to players, right? And giving everything to players' hands. This is fantastic. They can do everything and just, write the history as the new.
I mean, but one
Okay.
of
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah, yeah.
to add on this, one of the things that's interesting though is that a lot of these myths, a lot of these stories, have a common set of core archetypes and core events, and they follow a structure that even with the players take it and make it their own, it still ends up often retelling that story, perhaps differently, but it gets the basic beats. And it's not that you've told them to do this, it's that this is part of how we tell stories. And it's another thing that I just kind of find magical when you're able to pull it off in a game.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. David, you want to add something, or you guys want to elaborate on that topic more?
I'll just add that it is remarkable to me how often that happens, where players sometimes inadvertently, without realizing it, play out story beats from particular myth. How often in my Pendragon games, I don't try to make Guinevere into a an antagonist or a bad person, but how often the player knights end up siding against her, and seeing her as the problem. It's fascinating to me because it's just like, wow, okay, that's the archetype, is that she's kind of a victim of this system and misunderstood. I think, I find her a very sympathetic character actually, but it's they end
Everybody
up
hates Guinevere.
right. It's crazy. So I'm not trying to make them hate her, but there you go. So yeah, it's fascinating.
Okay, thanks. That was very broad. Okay, so I think let's move to my favorite, Glorantha. I mean, I'm smiling and I'm happy because just to make sure our audience is on the same page, I'm playing a campaign with Jeff right now. This month and since actually March, since epidemic, and we're playing Glorantha. And actually, because this is the Bronze Age, right? And I just want to ask you a question about the old systems as compared to the modern world, right? So you're veterans of the market and the industry, right? And you know that Glorantha, and there were another old system, old setting based on mythology. The Barker's Empire of the Petal Throne, and it was actually published in 1970s. And there's Tekumel, right, which is the world there, and it was influenced by Indian, Middle Eastern, Egyptian mythology. And if today someone was to create another one setting, a new game, should it be based on the same mythologies, right? Like those Egyptians or Indian, or even Bronze Age? How do you feel when talking about trends? Would it be a success nowadays, or should we create games based on any other various mythologies, right? Like Vikings or something? What do you think?
Oh man, I would love to see Tekumel get the attention that it deserves. I mean, it's a fantastic setting, but I think, and I'm just jumping into this first because I, as the creative director, this is part of my job is to think about it, and I think with mythology itself, it doesn't really matter where you start from. I can say some things that I think probably have been done to death, which is mythology based on the archetypes of gaming as an artifice of gaming. I think that's been done to death. But mythology that's been done that where you're trying to play around with what are the human questions about the great mysteries of your setting? I think that's always fresh. I mean, things I totally dig seeing. I would love to see something based on Navajo mythology. Would absolutely love to see that. I would love to see people play around more with Slavic mythology. I think that's very underused in the West.
Yeah.
I would love to see. I would love to also see people play around more with Central Asian and Iranian mythology, like if anybody's familiar with the Shahnameh, the Ferdowsi's great book of Persian history,
Whoa.
which
Wow.
was written, I think, 8th or 9th century. It has a history of the world from the beginning to the secret history of Alexander the Great and all that. I would love to see stuff on this.
It's
But
a nice setting.
oh yeah, it would be
Yeah,
awesome.
really nice
But
one.
the thing I think is that if you do a mythology where you've really approached the questions and these stories sincerely and seriously, and that doesn't, by serious I don't mean without a sense of humor, but where you're taking it, where it's an important part of your setting, I think you will always be good, because we always want to hear myths. We want stories, and for me, when I'm looking at a setting, if it doesn't have a well thought out or well constructed mythology of the setting, I'm not interested in it.
Okay, David.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I would say if you're playing a setting, if you're playing in a game where you're making a character and it comes to the part where you have to fill in who your patron deity is or what belief system you follow, and you can just leave that blank and it doesn't affect the game one way or another, then you're losing a lot. Like you need to start from, what does my character believe? How is my character raised? What are their belief systems? And yeah, you can definitely tell when a setting skimps on that. But as far as like basing new mythologies off of things, I mean, Jeff has already indicated how many untapped, rich veins of mythology there are just in our own global cultures. That I mean, one of the things that makes Techimail so brilliant is that it does mix up these different Indian, Hindu, Middle Eastern, Egyptian, like you said, mythologies all into this new vision. That Glorantha does the same thing. It's like, wow, this is familiar and yet new. So that's you know although we're working with archetypes, you want to find a balance between being too familiar or being too surface level, too superficial, while also giving people something they haven't seen before.
Okay. All right. But to be honest. Oh, okay. You want to say
I
something,
wanted to
Jeff?
bounce into this. One of the things that I'm a big fan of is syncretism, which is basically where you take different cultures and different beliefs and where they're communicating together to create a even more complex mythology or pantheon. And one of my favorite real world examples of this is the Silk Road during the period of the Greek empires. So one of my favorite little stories is in Tale of Christianity, the most widely dispersed cult on Earth was that of Heracles. And Heracles was a patron god or guardian from the Pillars of Gibraltar all the way to Buddhist temples in Japan, whereas Nio, he still graces. There are still statues of Heracles guarding the Buddha in Japanese Buddhist temples.
Yeah.
And where in early Buddhism, if you look at any of the art from the Indo-Greek period, so 2nd century BC approximately, you'll see Buddha meditating, and there's a guy with a beard and a big club at his side, and that's Buddha's buddy Heracles. And this is the stuff I love to see in gaming, because this is actually how human beings operate. They don't do these enclosed, hermetically sealed pantheons, but you end up with, you know, Buddha hanging out with Indra and Heracles because they're great pals, or the Greeks saying that, you know, the Egyptians actually know all the real secrets about the gods, because that's where all the gods used to hang out and told everybody everything. And this is stuff that I would love to see way more of in gaming.
Okay, yeah, I think same here actually. But
you just want to see Heracles and Buddha, you know, a buddy team, don't you?
To be honest, the truth to be told, yeah. But actually, I have to admit that when you said Slavic mythology, I would love to see more of games, to play more of games that are actually based on that. Actually, in Poland right now we have a new system. It's called Słowianie, Gra Fabularna, which is Slavic role-playing game. And yeah, it's getting more and more popular. But to be honest, actually, I think, and prove me if I'm wrong, I'd like to hear your opinion on that topic. Actually, the most popular is this Norse Scandinavian mythology. It dominates actually the pop culture, right? So including gaming market and games and so, you know, the entertainment. It's a fantasy trend, actually, I think. Or maybe not. Do you have another opinion, or why you think is that? So,
well,
Jeff.
You are absolutely right, Mary. I mean, Norse mythology hit, I think it hit a number of critical buttons going back to the late 60s and 70s, and just caught on. And, you know, some of this is comic books. You know, Thor is a pop culture icon in the United States. Part of it is neo-paganism. You know, you see an awful lot. I think Norse paganism and the symbol of Mjolnir, the Thor's hammer, is a popular thing. But also part of it is it's Vikings. You know, Vikings are like pirates plus barbarians. What could be cooler than that? And the irony is, we actually know more about Slavic paganism than we do actually know about Norse paganism. Most of the stories that we tell about Norse beliefs weren't written by people that had any contact with the people that believe this, and which is something I find is just a bizarre, and maybe that's part of the reason it's so popular, is that these stories were written for a different audience. You know, most of the better known Norse myths were written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th, 14th century, so centuries after Iceland was Christianized. And as a result, they were told differently. And I think that made it easier to understand. Whereas the Slavic myths that we know, because, you know, you still had elements of Slavic paganism much later than Norse, they're weirder to a westernized audience. They're just harder to access. And also, I think part of it is also that because the Norse language had a big impact on English.
Yeah, exactly.
Those you know, we call it you know, we have Thor's Day in the English language. It's easier for us English speakers to grasp these names. And so I think that's also a big part of why it became so popular.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah, David?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. You know, there's a cultural element. I mean, we put Christmas trees up in our houses, you know, because of that Teutonic and Norse paganism influence, you know, on our cultural heritage. I think also there's as Jeff said, you know, this is something that has only become popular, like, you know, in its current form in the last couple generations, where I think, you know, you have other myth cycles that are either completely unfamiliar to most American and you know, British audiences, like Slavic myths, which, you know, we also don't have as much information on just in general. But, and, you know, on the other hand, you have like the Greco-Roman myths, which I think are perceived as maybe kind of belonging to 19th century Victorian romanticism. You know, they're kind of a little stale, you know, it's like, oh yeah, we all know that. And people are still discovering, you know, people are still picking up the sagas and reading them for the first time and going, these are awesome, you know, because it just doesn't, it's popular, but it doesn't have that level of saturation that Zeus and Apollo have, you know.
Well, and if you don't mind me jumping in on this one,
Yeah, go
because
on.
as a corollary to this, I love the Greek myths. I love
Absolutely.
Aeschylus. I love Homer. But the way that those myths got received into our popular culture, certainly in the English-speaking world, is through proper Victorian gentlemen who took all of the sexiness away. They took, you know, these are stories of sex and murder and, you know, gods that are complete bastards, because it explains an important thing about the world, which is the gods aren't looking out for your best interest. The world is a dangerous and hostile place, which is why you really need to be sucking up to the gods, because left to their own devices, they're just going to make your life a total living hell. And you know, you read the original stories, and they're awesome. You know, it's one of the things that I've always noticed in the you know, one of the most interesting Greek gods for me was Dionysus, right? The culture bringer, the god of intoxication, you know, incredibly important, and usually bowdlerized out of the Victorian early 20th century retellings of it, because, you know, his cult is basically sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and that's not very appealing to Victorian gentlemen. And as a result, you have this great mythology that we've managed to turn into something boring and stale.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, something very interesting about this Greek and Roman mythology, because when I was a kid, and probably as you were also, I was taught at school that Greek and Roman mythologies are religions. And in case of Vikings, for example, it was always told, I was always told that it's magic, it's mythology. It's not like the same, right? And it was something very interesting, because, I mean, interesting and kind of irritating also, because, yeah, I was told that Greeks and Romans have their religion, and Vikings didn't, right? Don't. They have just mythology. And what's your opinion on that? I mean, you were, because, yeah, we're all different countries, but what is your actually impression on that? Did you have the same at school, David?
Well, you know, at school, I don't think we even covered Norse mythology. You know, if I did, it was probably independent learning in the library during reading time. You know, like finding books on the shelves and reading up on it. You know, we definitely covered Greek and Roman beliefs and mythologies. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There is almost like a hierarchy of like which mythologies are more legitimate, you know. Right. I agree.
Jeff?
I got them both from Bulfinch's Mythology when I was a kid. If anybody remembers the old Bulfinch mythology, and then
I have a copy on my shelf.
When I was a kid, that was when in pop culture, there was a comic book writer, Walt Simonson, who did the Thor Ragnarok series, which was a retelling of the Ragnarok myth with the Thor, you know, Marvel's long-haired Thor action figure character. And so at the time, I was like, wow, this stuff is so awesome, so exciting. but I think that was just a lucky bit of coming to age at that time.
Yeah.
But both, both are religions, or you could say neither are, because neither the Greeks nor the Romans nor the Norse had a core set of texts that said this is what you need. This is what being a Norseman is all about. Here, it's all in this handy book. Or
Yeah. Yeah.
the Greeks and the Romans just collected gods. That we've defeated this city. They even had a ceremony that when they defeated another people, they would bring that god into Rome, because that's where that god belonged. And so they had a unbelievably diverse pantheon that included a Black Rock, Kibela, the Great Mother, Bacchus, and Dionysus, and like most polytheistic people, they were able to embrace contradictions. And the Norse were likely the same.
Yeah, and I'd like to stop a bit with these pantheons and this religion comparison to mythology, because our world is dominated by monotheistic religions, right? And in games, actually, we tend to create pantheons. So more popular are those polytheistic religions. Why is that? Is that, because of giving more possibilities to the characters for players, David?
I think that's definitely a part of it. This is something that comes up in Pendragon a lot, because being set in a real world context, the mythologies, the belief systems, the religious cultures that these characters are coming from, all of the original Arthurian stories are Christian. They are based in a Christian context, and so in the game, you can play a Christian knight, or you can play a pagan knight. And I'm sure it varies table to table, but in my personal experience of running Pendragon, I'd say it's about at least 50-50 split, if not maybe even favoring playing pagan knights versus playing Christian knights, because there is baggage, with Christianity, with monotheism. These are current belief systems that impact people's daily lives. People grew up in Christian households, So by putting yourself into a different context, especially if you are not as familiar with pagan beliefs, or you are creating a new polytheistic pantheon, it's something that is coming in without any baggage,
All right, Jeff?
I've been putting a lot of thought into that question. I think that we've got this weird convergence of two things going on. There are a lot of, I know a fair number of very devoutly Christian or Muslim gamers as
Absolutely.
well. And they generally are reluctant to play around with their own religion in a fantasy setting. It's uncomfortable because it's sacred. These stories are sacred to them. And it's inappropriate for them to be treating them as a fictional thing. And it can make people very uncomfortable.
So, when I say baggage, I didn't mean that necessarily negatively, right? It's just like there's a lot of weight. There's a lot of weight on that.
These are sacred stories. So
exactly.
a lot of monotheistic writers and game designers tend to go for something that is very unlike their personal religious beliefs, because that gives them the room to be able to explore and play around with it without being uncomfortable. The flip side, there's an awful lot of people in the creative community that have had bad experiences with monotheistic religions. If you grew up in, if you're of my age and a gamer, you can remember the days when the moral majority tried to shut down gaming. You can remember when D&D was forced to get rid of demons and devils because that might cause people to become devil worshippers. And there's an understandable reaction against that.
Been there, done that,
and with an awful lot of LGBT players, there's also problems and difficulties that they've personally experienced because of the social beliefs of one denomination or another of a monotheistic faith. And so, you know, if for a lot of people out of the creative community, monotheism isn't appealing because it has other sorts of baggage for them. So it's basically, there's nobody that's in that narrow space of wanting to play around with it. That being said, there are a number of fantastic RPG settings that do have a strong monotheistic theme to it. One, Pendragon is right, you know, as the world is moving from polytheistic paganism to Christianity, and that's certainly going on within the setting. But World of Darkness is a monotheist. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a Cain.
Yeah.
Ars Magica as well. That Ars Magica has a well-defined. There is a heavenly realm and an infernal realm, and in between there's the realm of fairy. There's a lot of settings that have played around with this and played around with it very well, but they're greatly outnumbered by either polytheism or kind of a weird pantheonism. Yeah. Anyways, that's my convoluted answer.
All right, thank you. David, you want to add something more? Sorry, it's my cat. Okay, you.
Oh no.
Sure.
No worries. Well, I would just add, you know, to your question of why do we see so many games choose to go with polytheistic? Because certainly you could create your own original monotheistic religion just as well as you could create a polytheistic religion. And I think, you know, the simple answer there is it's maybe more fun for the creator to come up with, you know, 20 different gods, and, you know, each one has a different personality, and, you know, the worshipers differ in this way and that way. So, you know, that would be the other answer. That would be the more practical answer, I suppose. It's just, it's more fun.
Well, so. and yeah, if you grew up on stories of Norse or Greek or Roman mythology, then, you know, the idea of coming up with your own group of gods, that's cool. And it maps, again, when we talked about archetypes early on, it's easier to map a diverse bunch of deities onto archetypes than a single god.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And yeah, it gives more possibilities for the players, right? And it's sexier to choose which god I want to, you know, follow and so on. I think, yeah, as the player, it was always one of my interesting, the most I was always interested in, you know, riffling through the chapter with deities and religion. Yeah. All right, thanks. And now I want to know your very honest opinion. Which mythology sells best and why, Jeff?
Okay,
like in
best.
Gaming, of course.
In game, which real world mythology?
Yeah, which real exactly, like, you know, when you're basing your RPG system on particular mythology like Vikings, which mythology is best to sell, which is, you know, eye-catching and sexy for the players and the audience?
I think the religion that's got the broadest audience awareness is Norse mythology. That being said, I don't necessarily think that it would be the best if I wanted to come up with a real world mythology to base my setting on. I'm not sure that would actually be the best selling one, because there's so many people have done so much with it. There are you know, we have so many good and bad adaptations of Norse mythology out there. I actually, if I really, you know, I'd actually say Near Eastern, or, I mean, I would totally love to have something that was based on Babylonian and Sumerian with Marduk and Inanna right at that period of the Bronze Age, when you still have when the myths, most of your audience don't know it very well, but they are very, very vivid. I mean, I think that could do really well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you think there, David.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're at an interesting crossroads right now, where I think for a long time it was probably Norse mythology. You know, you slap Odin or Thor on the cover, and you know you
Yeah.
got a good product that people are going to check out. But I think there is a shift going on where people want to see some new things. One thing I keep seeing coming up is people talking about something based on the romance of the Three Kingdoms. You know, people want to see more stuff from like Chinese legends and mythology. You know, and you know my own personal one of my own personal loves, and you know, we touched on it already, but would be to see more Slavic influence fantasy because it's so rich. It's just so rich,
Yeah.
you know. So there's a lot of opportunities right now. I think actually, you know.
I'll tell you what. I was just thinking about that. What I totally dig to do as well
Mm-hmm.
would be something comparable to American Gods. You know, where are the
Yeah.
gods of mythology now?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that gets us to Nephilim very quickly. So,
Yes.
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 Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, interesting. But do you think Slavic, right? David,
Mhm.
do you predict maybe that does it have a chance to be another top of the top after the Vikings and Norse mythology, as we said, and we agreed that it's the most popular? Is Slavic something that might be next trend in popular culture? Do you think?
I certainly hope so. I think it's really just kind of getting it in front of people so they can see how cool it is, you know,
Mhm.
which is,
Yeah.
I mean, that's even something with the Arthurian mythology because unfortunately for a long time now, the last 40 years or so, you know, our visual media have failed us in terms of producing something really compelling with Arthurian stories. And I'm tearing my hair out on a consistent basis because I'm like, it's right there. Just do a direct adaptation of Chrétien de Troyes. You know, like you don't have to do a reinvention or a reimagining. Just put it out there. You know, and it's kind of a similar thing with Slavic mythology where it's just familiarizing people with these stories that have always been there. You know.
Look at the popularity of The Witcher.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, The Witcher has
Yeah.
done a
Yeah.
really
Yes.
good job
Yeah.
introducing this to a broader audience. So
Absolutely.
I absolutely think that it is one that's got a chance of being increasingly popular in the in Western Europe and the United States.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so because it's it's my country, so I'm very proud of the Witcher team. Yeah, and the other and CD Project Red. I really hope to see a Slavic RPG also somewhere on the world market, not only in Poland. But
Yeah.
because apart from the predictions of the market trends and so on, uh, I just want to at the end ask you about your preferences. Like which mythology? I know Pendragon, David.
Yeah.
I
Sure.
think so, yeah. But which mythology is you like the most? Which is the most inspiring for you for when writing games, David? Is it Pendragon and the Arthurian?
Well, I mean, you know, it can be. It can be certainly when I'm working on Pendragon. But you know, honestly, and Jeff's touched on this by talking about World of Darkness. I think one of the things that really deserves broader recognition, I think, in our popular culture, is all the work that game creators put into their own games mythologies. And I love reading other games you know, mythological treatments, whether it's based on something from the real world or something completely made up. You know, Mary, you said like you always go right to the deities chapter of a book. You know,
Yeah,
I'm the
yeah,
same way. You know, I love seeing what other people are coming up with because this is really kind of a ferment going on. You know, ever since gaming got started, of people just really going to town and riffing on new ideas, new approaches to mythology. So it's important not to get too self-referential within gaming tropes and you know like certain you know certain ideas have been done to death certainly, but yeah, I get a lot of inspiration out of reading other games and other treatments of mythology.
okay, thanks, Jeff. What about you?
Well, there's 3 mythological texts that I tend to go back to over and over again. One is the Mahabharata of Vedic early Hindu mythology. This is the Iliad on steroids, many times as big, and it is an amazing story, but it's also this amazing collection of myths, and sometimes sometimes it's very mundane, and then sometimes it diverges into weird philosophical discussions between characters about the nature of the cosmos. Wonderful, something that every game designer ought to have read. The other one every game designer ought to have read is the Iliad.
Yep.
Of course, definitely. Yeah.
Absolutely. But the other one that I would throw in, that's the third one into it, is the story of Inanna and the 7 gates. And this is the story of how Inanna, the Queen of Heaven, descended into the underworld in order to tell off her sister. Only to realize that she had shred all of her garments of power and was now naked and dead before her sister, who is the queen of the dead, and was really screwed. And so I had to figure out a clever way of getting herself out. So she said, well, don't torture me in the underworld. I've got a lover up above. You can have him. But it's a wonderful
deal.
Exactly. But it's a wonderful story about it's an older version of that Persephone and Hades story about the descent into death. Why are there seasons? Why does fertility go away? Why do we die? And these are stories that I go back to all the time as a writer.
Okay. Yeah, sounds interesting. Ooh. Definitely. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, that story and Babylonian mythology in general really informed my work in Berlin, the Wicked City, one scenario in particular, which you know, Jeff.
Which is basically a total riff off that.
Thank you. And then I would just also add, when you brought up Inanna, it just reminded me the Nihongi, which is the Japanese chronicles, which is their collection of origin myths and also the early history of their emperors and stuff. Some great stories in there in terms of, how the sun and the moon came to be, how death came to be, and funny. There's humor in these stories that it's laugh out loud at times,
And I'm actually going to let me throw a shout out to one other collection of it, which is underused. The Old Testament, the Torah, is it is an incredible source of mythic stories. Particularly those first 5 books. And especially if you read them and imagine it's Johnny Cash is telling them out, because you look at World of Darkness. That's what World of Darkness riffs off. That's what Ars Magica. There is a power to those stories as well. And as a writer, if you're developing mythology, it's certainly one to be familiar with, because
absolutely
so much of our secondary sources have been influenced by it.
Great. I mean, thanks. So many positions to read and to reach for. Thank you for the inspirations and for the amount of knowledge I got here. Before we end and say our goodbyes, I have a surprise for our audience, because we have a special coupon for Chaosium products for people watching this. The coupon code is PAX Online 2020. And it gives you 10% off your order. Of course, it's 1 use per account, and it expires on the 30th of September 2020. So remember that. Okay, gentlemen, thank you very, very much for this great discussion. I learned so much, and it was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, our audience, for watching us and spending this time with us. It was Jeff Richard and David Larkins from Chaosium.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This was great.
and be merry. Thank you very much. Watch online PAX 2020. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.